International Media TV, television that listens to you.
Hi, I'm Johnnie Burrell. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having us out here, and I guess I'm going to first say thank you to John. The origins of this book is that back in 2004, Juan and I wrote a white paper called "How Long Must We Wait," and you can actually get it online. And it was a 24-page white paper on just the history of people of color in the media, and we try to give a basic overview of what was going on in the past and the present, and we distributed the pamphlet at the Unity Journalists of Color Convention in Washington, D.C. in 2004 because Juan was the president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists at the time. I was the deputy director, and we were very much involved in the issue of media policy because at the time there was the Bush administration under Michael Powell was the FCC chairman, and he was really trying to have a massive deregulation of the broadcast industry. And as journalists, we knew that was just bad for democracy and bad for journalism. But as people of color, we know that whenever we have a media system that's centralized, that is consolidated, it really harms our communities because we cannot speak for ourselves. So John funded that. John liked the pamphlet. He gave us a grant. He was with the Ford Foundation to do the initial research on the book, and so that's what we, and the conclusion is what we have today. So thank you, John, for support. I just want to read you a quote. I'm going to read you two quotes. The first one his quote is, "We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. For in the press and the pulpit we have suffered much by being incorrectly represented." This was a quote from the first African-American newspaper ever published in 1827. It was called Freedom's Journal. And the idea that this quote is still relevant today. I mean, we are harmed as people of color when we cannot speak for ourselves, when other people tell our stories, because when they tell our stories, they often get it wrong. And the problem historically has been that we don't have the ability to communicate to a mass audience. We don't own radio stations, we don't own TV stations. Only 3% of all TV stations in this country are owned by people of color, and 8% of radio stations. But ironically, back in 1827, back in the early 1800s, there were dozens, about 100 newspapers before the Civil War that were people of color actually published and printed at a time of oppressive discrimination. And the reason being, as we discuss in the book, is because U.S. postal policy, ironically, back then heavily subsidized the delivery of mail. And that allowed people of color to actually have a voice because the postal system was a decentralized system. It was a system where the voices of many could actually speak. But ever since then, whenever new technology has come along, it has fundamentally changed the media system. So whether it's the telegraph comes along, or radio comes along, or TV or cable TV, the system changes. And when the system changes, the government has a decision. Does it allow the greatest number of voices of people to actually participate and speak for themselves? Or does it turn over control to the hands of a few? And the story since the 1840s to the present day is corporate interest really pressuring government to turn over control of whatever media system is being born or that's emerging to the hands of a few. So let me read you another quote and then leave you with something to think about, and I'll turn it over to Juan. If there were enough of our boys and Boy Scouts interested in wireless, they would erect a wireless station at the park. I am not sure that the arrangements could be made to have another station erected either at the African American building or at the YMCA. But as of yet, we're still interested in having more boys. Let us try to get together and form a good and up-to-date radio club in our city. I'll be more than pleased to help. This was a message written in the African American newspaper by a man named Roland Carrington. It was 1917. Before radio was regulated for the first time in 1927, people of color actually had amateur radio licenses, and they were actually creating radio clubs throughout the country. The Woodland Radio Association in Chicago, 1916, African American folks getting together and teaching each other how to broadcast, how to create build wireless stations, radio stations. a guy named John C. Rodriguez in San Antonio built had an amateur license in 1916. In 1922, he actually had a commercial license. But in 1927, the government regulates radio for the first time, turns over control to NBC and CBS. So today, if we look at today now, here in radio, we actually had the chance from the get-go, from the very beginning, to actually have a voice before it was regulated. Government comes, turns over to the hands of a few. Now we have the internet, the greatest communications network ever created, decentralized. We all have voices. We're all online. I assume everyone in this room is probably online and have some sort of online presence and able to participate in a greater public discourse online. Well, the internet, as we know it today, is under threat. The future of the internet is very much in danger with the issue of how many people have heard the word network neutrality. Well, that's glad to see. So, the big cable and phone companies are trying to orchestrate a corporate takeover of the internet, and the Obama administration right now is helping them. So the idea is that they will be able to speed up or slow down websites based on the person's ability to pay. So if you're a person of color, you don't have the financial means to pay to make sure your website is sped up, your website is going to be slowed down. And it's going to create the same kind of inequities in online for people of color, where we don't own our own image when big websites and big corporations are able to control the dissemination of information. All the stuff that we've been fighting for the past 100 years when it comes to the traditional media, broadcast media, is going to replicate itself online. And for people of color, that is, I think, for democracy, period, but specifically, I'm talking about people of color in this instant, it's a chance for us to be able to speak for ourselves, have an online presence. With millions of Latinos marched in 2006, it wasn't for a free and open internet. Folks use it to organize. So the last thing I say is I work for a public interest group called Free Press, and we're based in Washington, and we have 500,000 members. And what we try to do is to make the voices of everyday people heard in policy debates. So we try to take these complex information like the AT&T T-Mobile merger. Should we reform the Universal Service Fund so to make sure everyone has broadband access? These really complicated issues. We try to say why this is important for democracy. And, I invite you to definitely, check us out, read our book, because these issues, they're not arcane. They're really critical to the future of media and the future of us to be able to speak for ourselves. And I think I'll leave it at that. I'm going to turn over to Juan. We'll go more in depth about the book and examples of the historical racism. But the point I'm trying to say is that structural issues, centralization versus decentralization, government policy, it's critically important to determining whether we can be able to truly represent ourselves and really fight for self-determination of our community with the use of media. And it's critically important. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll turn it over to Juan so everyone knows Juan Gonzalez, right? We all know who Juan Gonzalez is, okay? So no need to introduce him, even though Amy Goodman said it's been 20 years since he's been arrested for last night, and he's kind of like slowing down because he's only writing books now. So I'll turn over to Juan.
Thank you, Joe, and to John Funabiki and the folks at San Francisco State, and to all of you for coming out. We had an event in New York last night, and I told people what I'm going to tell you. I've been a professional journalist in the commercial or corporate media now for nearly 35 years. I've also been actively involved in what we normally call the alternative or the dissident press, non-commercial, community press in America for the past 15 years with Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! In the early 80s, when I was in Philadelphia at the time, I founded a Spanish-language community weekly newspaper, Enfoque Comunal, and then edited, and basically serving the Puerto Rican community of Philadelphia, and severed my ties with that paper, I guess, about 4 or 5 years later, but the paper is still functioning, one of the main newspapers for the Latino community in Philadelphia. So I've been involved in the corporate media. I've been involved in alternative or the dissident and non-commercial media, and I've been involved in what is commonly called the ethnic media by some folks, the press by people of color. The amazing thing throughout all the time I've spent in journalism is, one, how these three presses almost operate, it's the same system, of media in America, but they all operate in different worlds independently of each other, sometimes not even recognizing each other's existence. The other thing is that in this country, we have access to more news and information than any people in the history of the world. The American people are drowning in information. We've got 1,400 daily newspapers, 12,000 radio stations, 1,200 television stations. We've got dozens now of 24-hour cable news operations. We've got hundreds of channels on cable to choose from. We've got tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of internet news sites available to us. We've got news at 5, at 6, at 10, at 12. You name it. There's a news, action news, or eyewitness news, or something happening all the time. And with all this media, the American people remain so remarkably misinformed about the world around them. So how is it possible to have so much media and so little knowledge? I realized a few years ago that despite all the time I'd spent in the media, I did not understand why the system was so resistant to providing quality news and information to the people, and especially this is felt even more strongly. Everyone dislikes the media, but African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans and people of color hate the media because of the constant misrepresentation and denigration of the everyday life of people of color in this country. So I realized that despite all the time I'd spent in the media, I didn't understand the system. So that's why we did this book. We figured, let's figure out what the source of the problem is. How did this mess that we call the American media come to be? And as Joe explained, the book here does two things. It provides, we believe, a cogent theory as to how our news system developed in America from the beginning to now. And at least it makes it understandable why and how it came to be. And as Joe said, it revolves around the fact that first, government policy is critical to our media system all the way through. Two, that technology is a destabilizing force, a revolutionary force, that every time a new technology comes about, it destabilizes the existing order and forces the government to come in and rewrite the rules of how information is disseminated to the people. And three, that race has been central. Not a marginal issue, not a side issue, not something that, we pay attention to when we have time. But race has been central to the development of the media and has been a major theme of the news media from the first newspaper, Public Occurrences, in 1690 in Boston, where the bulk of the copy was intelligence to the white settlers on what the savage Indians or skulking Indians were doing in and around the Massachusetts colony. And throughout the colonial period, a huge portion of the content of newspapers was information for the settlers about how to keep the natives of the Americas under control, and also about how to prevent, be warned of, or be wary of slave insurrections or violence by free blacks or enslaved blacks. Huge portion of the content. So race has been central to the content of the American media from the very beginning, and it's continued throughout the history of the country. The other thing that we discovered, and I call this the lurid scandal of American journalism, the number of examples that we uncovered, and we've got dozens of them in the book, where newspaper publishers or broadcast owners did not merely spread stereotypes, did not merely create ignorance on racial matters, but actively organized hostility, violence, pogroms, massacres, and riots geared at Native Americans, at the Chinese, at the Mexicans in the old Southwest Territory, once it was incorporated from Mexico after the Mexican-American War, and against African Americans. And the stories are unbelievable, some of them. I've mentioned this in some of the Democracy Now! Interviews. The Wilmington coup, to me, is the most astounding. In 1898, there was the only successful armed coup in the United States in Wilmington, North Carolina, where a band of 2,000 whites, in the white supremacists, marched into the town of Wilmington. Wilmington still had a majority black city council. It was the tail end of Reconstruction. In November of 1898, they marched into town, burned down the only black newspaper in the town, rounded up all the black city councilmen and their few Republican allies at gunpoint, ordered them out of town, appointed a former Confederate colonel as the new mayor of Wilmington, and then proceeded to attack the black community in several days of armed violence that resulted in about 60 African Americans being killed. This was a successful armed coup led by the editor and publisher of the Raleigh Observer, Josephus Daniels. He used his paper to prepare for it by constantly claiming corruption and abuse of white citizens by the black city councilmen. He used his newspaper offices to plan the insurrection, and then he boasted afterwards of its success. Now, you'd say Josephus Daniels, maybe he's just some crazy Southern editor. Well, no, Josephus Daniels was one of the leading Southern editors of his time. He was an advisor to Woodrow Wilson. When Wilson becomes elected president, Wilson names him Secretary of the Navy. He ran our Navy during World War I. One of his assistants that he mentored was a young undersecretary named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When FDR gets elected president, he names Josephus Daniels ambassador to Mexico. Josephus Daniels was a major political figure in this country who led a massacre, organized with his newspaper, a massacre, overthrew a locally elected government, and helped mastermind the murder of 60 people and was never held responsible for any of it. But there are many other examples of newspaper editors who are involved in these use their newspapers not to educate or inform the people, but to create hostility, division, and hate. And that's why I call this the lurid scandal of American journalists. Now, interestingly enough, a few years ago, the state of Wilmington appointed a race commission. The state of North Carolina appointed a race commission. They issued a long report about what had happened in Wilmington in 1898. All the papers that were involved apologized to the public for their role in what had happened. But this is like 100 years later, right? This is 100 years later. And the damage was done to that black newspaper in Alex Manly's paper in Wilmington. And in the book, we have the photo of about 100 or 200 armed whites standing proudly outside the black newspaper after they've burned it down. And we have numerous other examples of journalists of color who were hounded in this country because they dared to speak up and tell a different story, and who have been largely forgotten in normal journalism accounts. I'll leave you with one last example, because it's a radio example, is Pedro Gonzalez, and it's especially appropriate for the era in which we live. Pedro Gonzalez was a radio announcer in Los Angeles in the 1930s. He was a great singer, had a few hit records, and then got a radio show basically for his group, which was called Los Madrugadores, the early risers. And he had an early morning show that he and his band would sing to the farm workers as they went out to the fields of Southern California early in the morning. And then in 1930, President Herbert Hoover begins to organize a mass deportation of Mexicans throughout the country as the Depression is heating up and the national press is calling for getting rid of all these illegals. Sound familiar? And so there was a mass deportation. You know, the Obama administration recently set the record for 400,000 in 1 year, and now there's 1 million in 3 years. Well, Herbert Hoover deported about 1 million in about 18 months back in 1930-31. One of the few people in the radio to stand up to it was Pedro Gonzalez. He used his radio program to expose the abuses of Mexicans that were being deported, basically herded onto trains and shipped out into back to Mexico. The Los Angeles District Attorney indicts Pedro Gonzalez for rape. He's convicted and sentenced to 1 to 50 years in San Quentin. He's in San Quentin not too long before he organizes the first hunger strike of the inmates of San Quentin against their prison conditions. Sound familiar? And a few years later, the woman who had accused him of rape recants, admits that she was put up to fabricating the story by authorities who wanted to get rid of Pedro Gonzalez's voice, and he's released in 1940, but he's immediately deported to Mexico, where he then becomes a radio announcer in Tijuana, and for decades was a popular radio announcer in Tijuana, but could only come back into the United States late in his life when he died in Southern California at the age of, in his mid-90s. Now, Pedro Gonzalez is a hero of American journalism. He's a hero of speaking truth to power, but yet he's virtually unknown. And just as many others, Ida B. Wells and Jovita Idar and so many others. There were many here in San Francisco. Obviously, the birth of the birthplace of the Chinese press in America, in 1854 with Golden Hills News, but one of the early papers that really was very influential in the Chinese community here in San Francisco was in the early 1900s, China West, and the editor of the paper, Ning Pun Chu, was once interviewed by the Herald Examiner, and he said a quote that caught our eye, because what we did is we tried to, in the book, tell the stories as those editors wrote them. So we quote extensively some of their original publications. And this is an interview that he held, and he says, "It is peculiar, but nevertheless true." This is the editor of China West talking in 1909. "That in San Francisco, the yellow man gets out the white paper, and the white man gets out the yellow paper. We run a conservative paper in every way. It is cleanly edited, and our whole aim is to educate and elevate the Chinese people, to make them better citizens and better people." And he waged in his paper campaigns constantly, for instance, after the San Francisco earthquake in 1906, when they wanted to remove the Chinese from the devastated area and rebuild the area. He used his paper to urge them to the Chinese residents to fight to stay in their neighborhood, to prevent the government from removing them under the excuse of rebuilding after the earthquake. And he was constantly urging the Chinese to get involved in politics as much as they could, to be able to exercise whatever rights they could here in the United States, because obviously between 1885 and World War II, as a result of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the government's own first racist immigration policy, Chinese were excluded in large numbers from coming into the country. So that we try to tell these stories about the heroes of journalism that have been forgotten, and we also try to explain how the whole system evolved. And that basically is what we try to do in the book. It's not a soundbite. It's a little dense reading at times. But those of you who take the time to go through it, I guarantee you we'll have a whole new view of how our news system functions today and how it has functioned throughout history. Thank you. Oh, yes. Well, you know, the interesting thing that we discovered when we were looking at the story of Native Americans in journalism was not only about the amazing Native American press that developed in the country. Beginning in 1828, when Elias Boudinot founded the Cherokee Phoenix in Georgia, and several other papers that came out later on in the Indian country when all the natives were removed to the west, in Shawnee and the Cherokee Advocate and a bunch of other newspapers. But it's also that several Native American journalists played key roles in what are commonly called Anglo newspapers. One of them was John Rollin Ridge, who founded the Sacramento Bee, was the first editor and publisher of the Sacramento Bee, and who used the paper initially to not only do general news, he did all the general news of the day in Sacramento, but also to advocate against the continued attacks on the native populations of California. But about a year or so after he started the paper, he sold it to one of his employees, James McClatchy. And James McClatchy then took over the Sacramento Bee and built it into an empire, which became the McClatchy newspaper chain. But if you go to the website of the McClatchy newspaper, or you look at the official company histories, there's no mention that the flagship paper of the chain was started by a Native American writer. So too was the San Diego Union, started by a Native American writer and editor, Ned Bushyhead, who was the principal owner of the San Diego Union. And continued to run the paper for many years. We found that of all the people of color, Native Americans were the only ones who broke at such a level into the Anglo or white press early in U.S. history. There were a few African Americans or Latinos who made it into the mainstream of white press. It was Thomas Morris Chester, who was a Civil War correspondent for the Philadelphia Press, and there was Jose Agustin Quintero, who actually started at Ranchero in San Antonio in 1850s, but later became a longtime editor for the New Orleans Picayune. But they were very few. There was T. Thomas Fortune, who had his own paper, the New York Age, but also wrote for some New York City white papers for a while. But they were few and far between. It wasn't until the 20th century, and it really wasn't until the 1970s that the media in America was integrated. And we must understand that it was integrated not out of the goodness of the hearts of the publishers and the station owners. It was integrated because a mass civil rights movement forced open the doors. Between 1971 and 1973, there were 340 license challenges to the broadcast licenses of TV and radio stations in America. As all over the country, African Americans and Latinos walked into the stations and said, we're not going to take it anymore. We want you to cover our communities fairly. We demand that you put on shows to speak to our community. We demand that you hire people to report the news. And if you don't, we're going to Washington, we're going to challenge your license. And that's how the media began to change in America as a result of that huge community pressure. And that's when you started getting all of the first African Americans and Latinos into television, the Ed Bradleys and the Geraldo Riveras, and right here in San Francisco, Isabel Durón and others. They got in not because they were always qualified to do the reporting, but they were never given the opportunity until there was this huge civil rights movement that forced open the doors. So that's, that's a story that needs to be understood and told, that the change can occur, but it usually occurs as a result of pressure. Public pressure, community pressure. My favorite story, because I knew some of the people who were involved in 1972, when the public broadcasting system was really just developing after the Congress passed the public created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And 1972, a group of young Latinos who were fed up with the fact that PBS had been operating now for several years and there was no programming for Latinos, they all volunteered one day with Channel 13 in New York, WNET, to go in for the pledge drive. You've seen the pledge drive? And they all came in, and, in the old days, they would have all the people with the phones, answering the phones, getting the pledges in, they'd show them in the background. So all these Latinos volunteered one day to go and volunteer for the pledge drive. And in the middle of the pledge drive, they took over the station. And they walked away from their phones. They sat in the station. Channel 13 went black. The only time it's ever happened. It went black while they called in the police and hauled everybody out. And they arrested a bunch of people, several hundred people outside. But the result was that PBS created a national Latino show, which was called Realidades. And it operated for many years, and it was probably the best public broadcasting show about the Latino experience in America. But it also arose out of pressure, not because some executive made the decision that this had to be done, because they were forced to do it by the pressure to open up the media to more diverse voices. So this is all, the stories that we tell in the book about these community struggles, the journalists, and also the bigger picture, how does the system operate?
Yeah. I just want to add real quick. Juan is saying the community pressure allow folks to open the doors. But also, the community pressure changes the culture and also changes policy. We have in our book, we talk about the WLBT case in Jackson, Mississippi, in which local African American community activists, along with the United Church of Christ, challenged a license in Jackson, Mississippi, because in Jackson they were allowing white supremacists on the air to denounce integration efforts. If Thurgood Marshall got on the air to talk about desegregation, they would cut the signal out and say cable problems, technical problems. So that case allowed U.S. citizens, believe it or not, didn't have the right to challenge a broadcast license until this case. The court ruled that the citizens do indeed have a right to challenge a broadcast license. And after that, literally in Atlanta, and there wasn't a city across this country that was in fact San Antonio, black and brown groups literally challenged the licenses of all the stations in their community. And the thing is, today a broadcast license is tougher to challenge because for a lot of reasons, but one is because they're up every 8 years. It's a long time. Back then it was 3 years. So the constant pressure of these broadcasters continue to get these license challenges that would be hung up in courts, and then the next period the next time a few years later the broadcast license up again. So the constant challenge to resolve this issue led to these agreements between citizens and the broadcasters that were legally binding, that forced open these doors. So it was, again, it's a change of policy as well. We can't. That's why policy is so critically important. It's not just yes, we have to put the pressure, but we also have to change the laws as well. I think I'm optimistic and pessimistic. I'll start with the pessimistic. Unfortunately, I've talked about this a lot. I think traditionally our nation's civil rights groups have played that role in challenging this, and challenging broadcast licenses, and challenging the media companies. But there's been a departure over the past decade of the role of civil rights groups and these media companies because, for instance, all the civil rights groups supported the Comcast NBC merger, which would be unthinkable in another time. The amount of money that's being poured into these groups have kind of, for instance, Mark Morial, right, an example, would rail against the lack of African Americans on the Sunday morning talk show. Mark Morial is the head of the National Urban League. But he testified in Congress the NBC Comcast was going to buy NBC, that this was good for the black community. But meanwhile, that Sunday he testified. He's on Meet the Press. So it's so. What's it going to take? That kind of pressure. I mean, that's a pressure that built up over a long period of time. It wasn't overnight. I read the Freedom's Journal quote. There's another example in here we have in a book where the Pittsburgh Courier in 1931 were so upset with Amos and Andy, the radio show, black minstrel show, the most popular radio show in America. Half the national listener audience, half the radio audience was listening to this program every night. They started a petition drive to get African Americans to say, take this show off the air to the Federal Radio Commission. 740,000 people sent in letters to say, get the show off the air, and the Federal Radio Commission just ignored it. So it takes a long time for this change to happen, and so that's why I'm a little pessimistic. Optimistic, I think there is a lot of great groups out there who are organizing out there that you just don't hear about every day, who are really educating the community about what's going on. Pluriel Marshall, we had him in a believe it or not, even though that book is thick, it was thicker. And so he was in there. William Wright actually trained. William Wright ran a group called Black Efforts for Soul and Television. It was really a remarkable group. He ran the group for about 4 or 5 years, and he got sick and had to step away. But he would go around the country and train African American organizations to challenge licenses. But more than that, his rhetoric. I mean, this guy was in the face of the FCC. The Black Efforts for Soul and Television will say the FCC is a racist institution. The pressure they placed on the FCC for not having a black FCC commissioner led to the first FCC black commissioner, Ben Hooks, in 1975. An amazing man, amazing group. And Pluriel Marshall ran the National Black Media Coalition. I think I'm screwing got the name right. And he did that for several decades. And he started off, I believe, as a radio DJ from Houston and working in Houston and organizing in Houston. We had him in the book because of space. He was out, but William Wright, he took the mantle from William Wright in about 1973. Very pivotal. So we have a lot about William Wright in there, and we even had more. Broadcasting Magazine, which is the magazine that covers the industry, very sympathetic to the industry. They just hated William Wright. They would rail against everything he was doing. It was like anarchy on the air. You know what was going on with all these license challenges. So he was critically important guy. Absolutely.
Well, this is one thing that we don't delve into it too much, but it's we raise it in terms of the need to misinform the American people. The mass media in America, and by mass media, obviously the first media were largely newspapers. The first news media were largely newspapers. The early newspapers throughout the colonial period and the beginning part of the country were basically newspapers that were read by the elite. I remember in the early 1900s, there were no newsstands in the big cities. There were usually people subscribed to the newspaper for a year in advance. The newspaper was delivered by the postal system. It used to cost about $10 a year, which back then was a lot of money, to buy a newspaper. So that the newspapers through the colonial period up to about 1830 were largely for the educated, the elite, the clergy. That's who read newspapers. Then Benjamin Day revolutionizes and brings the press and brings the real mass media when he creates a penny paper. He came up with the idea, one, not having these broad standard sheets, but having a smaller tabloid that would be sold on the streets of New York by children that he would hire, by newsboys, and he would only charge a penny for the paper. And Benjamin Day's paper, The Sun, becomes the first true mass circulation paper in America. It quickly shot up to about 10,000 circulation. At one point, it was the largest circulation in the world. And then all the other papers began to follow Benjamin Day's example. So basically, the mass press in America develops in the 1830s. What else was happening in America in the 1830s? Propertyless white workers were getting the right to vote. Right, one by one, all the states, beginning in the 1820s and early 1830s, removed property qualifications for voting, and the number of people voting in America, and this is strictly within the white population now, the number of people voting in America increased dramatically. Between the 1824 and the 1828 election, when Andrew Jackson is elected. So what happens is the mass circulation press in America developed at the very moment that American workers were getting the right to vote. And to some degree, I believe that what was going on was that there was an understanding that one person, one vote is a very dangerous thing. Because one person, one vote means the majority might not do what those in power want them to do. So that as more and more workers got the right to vote, there was a need to inform and influence those workers, not only to sell them products, but to inform their, to influence their thinking. So I don't believe it is a coincidence that the mass circulation newspaper develops as the franchise is expanded in America's history. And in fact, in a democracy, there's much more. The media are much more important than a dictatorship, because in a dictatorship, the dictators just like rely on the police and the repressive apparatus. But in an industrial democracy, where you have the vote, you must be able to influence people. You know, I've been in the commercial media now, I told you, for 33 years. I believe that what newspapers and TV do, they love to do public opinion polls. Why do they do public opinion polls? They put out a story, and then you take a poll to see how well the people have digested the story, or digested what they're being told. And this is the way. And we're not talking about this always independent editors and publishers, but talking the system as a whole. That's what happens. So I think that precisely this is the mass media has become so pivotal precisely because there is one person, one vote in America. And the masses of people should not become too independent. And that's why independent media, alternative media, dissident media, ethnic media are so important, because they tell a different story. They give a different perspective and viewpoint. And that's why I've always stayed in the commercial press and in the alternative press at the same time, because I think that both play a role. And unfortunately, the commercial press often plays a bad role, but there are many good people who want to do good journalism, but just get lost, or they get afraid of their bosses, or they're worried about their next raise, and they get jaded after coming out of journalism school thinking they're going to change the world. But the media workers are still there, and they really want to do, most of them, I think, the right thing. It's just they get carried away by the tide of whatever that's happening in their newsroom or in their TV station or whatever. The Idad family was a wonderful family, the entire family. The father had been a union organizer, and then he moves to Laredo and begins a newspaper in the late 1890s, and he and his two sons, and Jovita at that time is a school teacher. She gets fed up with the segregated school systems in Texas, where the Mexican kids are always in the worst schools and the Anglo kids are always in the best schools. So she gives up on teaching, and she decides she can do better as a newspaper editor. So she takes over the editing of the newspaper for her family and does amazing, amazing articles and investigations of life in South Texas. She eventually leaves and ends up becoming a nurse in Pancho Villa's army in Mexico for a while, and then comes back to the United States, so somewhat more of a radical, and starts publishing a radical newspaper in Laredo. Her family still owns the Crónica, the main newspaper in Laredo. And when U.S. troops are sent to the U.S.-Mexico border, she writes a bunch of articles opposing it. The Texas Rangers right into town, surround her newspaper, and are about to shut it down, and she stands in the doorway and reads them the Constitution and tells them that she has a right to a free press, and apparently there's a big standoff, and if you've been to the border, you know, Laredo is like about 90% Mexican, so I think the Rangers decided to leave, and so that, you know, the folklore is that Jovita Hidart stood off the Texas Rangers. The only problem is they came back later that night and they destroyed her press. And so that was the end of her paper. But yeah, she was a very romantic and determined figure in Latino journalism in the early 1900s. But there were many others. Ricardo Flores Magón, Catarino Garza. There were many others that also played the same role of speaking truth to power and raising inconvenient truths. Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, the great thing about the first great internet was the postal system, and the first great communications debate in the United States was over the creation of the postal system, and the founders decided that they needed a postal system that could especially deliver newspapers, because remember, the country had just come through a war with England. You had all these colonies and people scattered throughout the colony. It was basically a rural country. How do you keep the country united? You needed to spread information and to the citizens of the new country. So Jefferson and Washington both favored the government delivering newspapers for free. All right. Madison and some of the other founders said, no, it should be at the market rate. This is all papers, the postal system in general. So what happens is that in the great debate that's like always in the United States, there's a compromise. And instead of free or market rate, they created something in between, which came to be known as second-class postage or bulk mail, and so that's how newspapers were delivered throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. The bulk of the delivery of the post office was not letters. 90% of the weight of the American mail throughout the 19th century was newspapers. 10% was mail. Right? Basically, the government was delivering at subsidized rate because the people who were sending letters were paying a much higher rate, first-class mail. Second-class, that's basically what the post office did. The post office was the largest employer in the United States government until the Civil War, when the Army, there were more postal employees than there were soldiers in the U.S. Army until the Civil War. So you can argue that the main job of the United States government for the first 60 years after the Postal Act of 1792 was delivering newspapers to its people at subsidized rates. And they did it because they believed that the dissemination of news and information was critical to the preservation of the democracy. So now think of that. Those kind of people, founders thinking about communications policies, and the people thinking now, these days, about internet policy. Is that what they're thinking about? That the most important thing is the dissemination of news and information to the people? Or is it to who can sell the most products and who can monetize these new technologies? So that the debate has really degraded in the political circles as to what the information system of the country is. Now, the reason why African Americans and Latinos and others could get papers out is because once they printed them, the government delivered them, right? And so the only problem was that after about the 1840s, the southern states rebelled against abolitionist newspapers coming into the South, and so the postal system bowed to the Southerners and would not deliver abolitionist newspapers into the South. But generally speaking, the law was that the government had to deliver any newspaper, no matter what it said. You know, as long as it was put into the mails, the government had to deliver them. So that allowed you, if you could print a paper, to get it to people. And it made it possible for this country to have more newspapers per capita and a greater reading public than any country in the history of the world as a result of federal communications policy as expressed in the post office. Okay, well, we're going to have to end it there, but thank you very much for being so attentive, and I hope you enjoy the book.
So I think Juan and Joe can stick around for a little while to sign books, which are on sale. Two little PSs on what Joe and Juan were telling you about. With the black newspapers, many of the during that time period, the Chicago Defender, one of the most important black newspapers, was able to distribute its newspapers to the South by using the railroad workers, the railroad porters, who would personally carry the newspapers onto the trains and then drop them off along the route. That was their way of getting them out. And second, on the Latino media and the history, there's a great resource called Voices for Justice. It's a history of the Latino news media that was organized by El Tecolote, a bilingual newspaper here in the Mission District. So that's a great resource for you. I want to thank both Juan and Joe for coming out here, and then I'm going to grab them and ask them to autograph my book. I hope you'll do the same. Thank you.